Okay, hi there. It's Miss Harrison, Miss Wan, and Mrs. Marshall here to go over the significance of the opening stage directions in the play An Inspector Calls. So by now, you would have been set a task where we asked you to read the beginning of Act 1 up to when the inspector arrives. But today we're just looking at the opening stage directions. If you want to, well, when you follow this lesson, you should have some paper and you can write down the key quotes, or if you've got a printer, make sure you print out the quotes that we send to you in the document. So we're going to just go over what you'll be doing in today's session, and I'm going to show you the next slide. So in today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on two methods used by Priestley to introduce the Birling family before you actually hear the characters speak. And there's two things that are important, the setting and characterization. Okay, so what are the key quotes to focus on? So you should have read the stage directions, and we're just going to go through some key ones. So as you're going through, it might be a good idea to highlight them, or like I said, jot them down. So in the opening, it's really important that we look at the setting. So Priestley intentionally uses the setting to give you an idea of what the Birlings could be like. Okay, so the setting is very indicative of their status. I think I want to draw attention to the fact that the play takes place in the dining room for all of the play. It doesn't take place in any other setting. And I think that this is quite important because I think it shows you how insular the Birling family are. They're quite cut off from the rest of society. And when the inspector arrives on this evening, I think it gives this idea of him violating this quite private sphere in order to shine a light and actually enlighten them to issues that could be going on outside of their environment. So why has he used the term fairly large? Well, I think that could be because whilst it does show you the status of the family, it's fairly large because Mr. Birling hasn't come into this position through a family lineage. He's come through this through he's a self-made man. He's an owner of a factory, and therefore he's come through it through new money. He is, and I think this quite shows them that actually this idea that he's keen to be upwardly mobile, and the fact that they've talked about the prosperous manufacturer, I think is quite important, because what it shows you is that the way that Mr. Birling's made his money is through capitalism. So you might have done a bit of reading around capitalism when you learned about this in your year 9, and this idea that whilst you could argue that Britain's economy was thriving because of the Industrial Revolution, the issue was that it was only a very, very small percentage of people that profited and gained from that wealth, and Mr. Birling is one of them. Okay, and so that's one of the things that I think is quite important, that I think Priestley wants to show you that particular element of Mr. Birling and how his status, how he's come to that status. So I'm just going to look at this idea of the fact that the furniture is good, solid furniture of the period, and the general effect is substantial and heavily comfortable, but not cozy and home-like. So when we look at this idea of the fact that the furniture is heavily comfortable, I think again this could link to the idea that the money that they've made from capitalism, which is probably, well, not probably, has oppressed many working class people, has made their life very, very, very comfortable. Okay, and and this kind of contrasts with the suffering of the working class. And another thing we need to think about here is, why is it not cozy and home-like? This is something you associate with someone's house, that it's meant to sort of exude warmth. Okay, that a family who lives there, it should exude I can't speak today, exude warmth, but it's not cozy. And this could show you something about this family, that maybe they're not particularly very close to each other. I'm just wondering whether Miss Harrison or Mrs. Marshall has anything to add to that.
Yes, so hi everybody, this is Mrs. Marshall. So that's fantastic. I don't think there's much I could add really, other than to say that it perhaps highlights a bit of a double standard, that the Birlings, you know, are happy to be upwardly mobile and to profit from capitalism, but in the rest of the play, they don't seem very happy for the working classes to be upwardly mobile. They seem positively threatened by the idea of the working classes demanding more pay or better working conditions. So that would be perhaps a nice thing to think about in terms of going forward for the rest of the play.
Excellent. So we're just going to move on to a next quote that we think is quite important in stage directions, and this is the use of lighting. So I'm going to hand this over to Mrs. Marshall, and she's going to talk to you about this quote.
Fabulous. Okay, lighting. Oh, the slides even change as well. This is so exciting. So sort of moving on from what Mrs. Wan has said about the idea of the family, the Birling family, being very comfortable, perhaps very smug with their lives. The connotations of the colour could be quite important in the lighting here. And Priestley is unbelievably specific in his stage directions in the play, throughout the play, but also in this opening situation as well. When we've studied things like Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth, you hardly get any stage directions, but it's really important that he's thought carefully about how he wants the play to be staged. And you can absolutely comment on this just as much as you could quote something that a character actually says. Also analysing the stage directions here tonight in this lesson, you can take quotations obviously to zoom in on keywords in the stage directions as well, because this is key to his intention. So you could zoom in here on the connotations of the colour pink. Perhaps it might call to mind the idea of sort of a rosy hue, maybe thinking about the idea of rose-tinted spectacles. If you've not come across that expression before, to look at something with rose-tinted glasses means to look upon it more favourably, more positively than it actually was. Just as you might look back on your memories of primary school and think, oh, wasn't it brilliant? And then actually at the time you didn't love it. You might look back on something from your past and sort of ameliorate it in your mind and think of it as much better than it was. And this perhaps is a reflection of the Birlings' life, that they live inside this sort of pink tinged world where everything is rosy for them and they don't really have to worry about anything. Again, linking back to Miss Wan's comment about the cosy, comfortable life, the sense of security compared to the struggles of the working classes. Again, there's a few different interpretations of that colour. You could, some commentators have thought about the pink intimate lighting of being symbolic of the potential romance at the beginning. It's supposed to be an engagement party after all, although as we hear a little bit more about it, it doesn't seem all that romantic. It seems more of a financial contract in terms of the way Birling talks about it, more like a business arrangement. But it is the meal that they're having is actually to celebrate an engagement. But the key that you'd want to focus on in terms of analysing this quote is the juxtaposition between the lighting before the inspector arrives and then how that then completely contrasts when he arrives, and we get the words brighter and harder used to describe the lighting. So this could be symbolic of the idea that the inspector enlightens the family, sheds some uncomfortable truths on the evening, forces them to confront a rather ugly side of their character and their past. So it could be almost thought of as like an interrogation type light, you know. that he's shining light on the truth and trying to force them to come to terms with what they've done. And it's more successful for some characters than others, as I'm sure you'll remember. So what have the other teachers got to say about this? Mrs. Harrison, we've not heard you yet. How are you doing tonight?
I'm great, thank you. A little bit sunburned, but albeit well. I
think intimate.
But yeah, I think the one thing that I like to zoom in on is the adjective harder. And I think that, you know, Mr. Birling in the opening stage directions and in Act 1 comes across as this hard-headed businessman. And yet the irony here is that the adjective harder is being used to describe when the inspector comes in. So the inspector himself is quite a hard man in the fact that he kind of waltzes in on the Birling family and kind of trashes this intimate setting, and like you've already said, enlightens them and puts a spotlight on their wrongdoings and kind of brings to light and sheds light on you know, the plight of the poor and things like that.
Beautiful, thank you. Back to you, Mrs. Wan. Anything else to add?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to pose a quick question before we moved on to the next quote, which is, do you think like the Birlings have quite a romanticized view of themselves? Like it kind of reflects maybe how self-content they are with their lifestyle, and that's why they're not bothered about sort of helping anybody else. I'm not really sure where you could link it back to. I don't know whether people agree with that.
I think they definitely do. I think they have definitely have a sort of a false arrogance. They think they're above the law. They don't think, you know, which is quite clear when the inspector comes in later, that they're not used to being rattled. They're used to, and we'll come on to that when we look at the description of Gerald in a minute, but they're used to everything being very easy and using their privilege so that life has no worries really. So yeah, I think they do. Perhaps it could be linked to the idea that they're almost kind of untouchable.
Okay, right. So thank you, Miss Marshall, Miss Harrison. It's really, really good interpretation so far. I'm just going to move on to the use of props, and Miss Harrison's going to talk to you guys about that. Just move on to this. Okay, well.
Okay, guys. So Priestley uses props and staging to again give a bit more insight into the Birlings and their kind of status